Financial leadership is changing. CFOs no longer record history. They make history. This podcast will help you become a better leader, strategic thinker, and digital visionary. Welcome to Secrets of Rockstar CFOs, the ultimate podcast for chief financial officers. Follow along as Jack McCullough engages in exciting chats with accomplished CFOs, learning how they overcame obstacles and positioned their companies for the future. Here's your host, Jack McCullough.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Secrets of Rockstar CFOs. You can follow us online at rockstarcfos.com. I'm your host, Jack McCullough. By day, I'm the president of the CFO Leadership Council. Let's rock. Really excited by the guest we have today. He's a good friend of mine and arguably the most technically astute CFO that I've met in my career. Glenn, welcome to the Secrets of Rockstar CFOs.
Jack, great to be here. And I think, is this going to turn into a roast where you and I are just hurling insults at each other, or are we can actually stay on topic here?
I'll try to go as far as I can without throwing any insults, and you'll do the same. So the contest will be which one of us cracks first. So
yeah, right.
Well, I'd say I know most people are listening, but my shirt is the gift that we'll keep on giving should we decide to start insulting each other. For those on YouTube, will see it. It looks like Joker purple. So cool. Anyway, so Glenn, by background, he's the CFO at Eventus Advisory Group. And what's interesting is he's the author of a book called Deep Finance, Corporate Finance in the Information Age, which is one of the best books, perhaps even the very best book that I've read for financial leaders who recognize the need to stay technically savvy, that, mastering technology is really the defining trait of the future financial leaders. So if you're in that category, I would definitely recommend picking up the book. He's also become recently a must follow on social media. And again, one of the few experts that I've spoken to, and believe me, I've interviewed quite a few, who's both an expert on financial leadership and generative AI. So really, it's going to be a great broadcast. And Glenn, I know you're really busy these days, so thanks for making the time.
Happy to be here. Always looking for an opportunity to hang out and talk.
There you go. Yes, that's one thing both of us seem to like doing. But I want to, before we get into this, because it is fascinating, but a little about your own career progression, because you're one of the few CFOs that I know that started out as a journalist in the Navy. So I'd love to find out how a naval journalist became a CFO.
Yeah, I'll try to give the Cliff's Notes version of this because it was a meandering path early in my early career. But here's the short part of it. As a journalist, I was a journalist. I'm dating myself a little bit here. I was a journalist in the mid to late 90s when websites were first coming around, and all the publications wanted to move their print magazine to the web. And I've always been a wannabe developer. So back then I was really into building web pages and HTML and JavaScript. And, I think I was kind of an early adopter on that. So as a journalist, a big part of my job through the late 90s was moving the magazine I edited to an online presence. And so I was in technology there, and then got married and realized that as a journalist, that probably wasn't going to be the best way to support a family long term. So I would love to say that I was a very sage predictor of the future and knew that journalism was going to be a tough career road, but I wasn't quite that prescient in what I was saying. I just saw that I needed to maybe move into the business world. And I did have a business interest, and I did a lot of business writing as a journalist as well. So went and got an MBA, and my first job after an MBA was not in finance. It was in marketing, because I thought, well, I know the tech side of it. I can write. Anyway, I was a product manager for this website builder. It was a pretty cutting edge tool at the time. Think of all these website builders you use today that are just template driven. Well, this was in 1999, so there weren't very many of them. And I was working at a telecom company, and I was the product manager for this tool, and I was super excited about it. But it was hard to get the kind of support that I thought the product needed. So with my freshly minted MBA, I decided that I was going to find budget dollars. So I got a sales and marketing budget and started like moving that around and advocating for my product. And somehow in that role, I became the finance guy for the sales and marketing group, and then did that for a while until I was poached actually by not the CFO, the COO, who wanted someone like me to manage his budget. So from there, I kind of moved from kind of a FinOps role, a RevOps at one point, and then started tracking metrics really early. But I was managing about a $200 million budget back then, and I started interacting with finance and accounting a lot, and we started doing. It's telecom in the early 2000s at this point, and doing a lot of M&A activity. So I became part of the due diligence team and really got thrown into the fire early, and kind of moved my early career through telecom at increasingly higher levels, and then got a lot of trial by fire through all the M&A activity that was going on. And once I got a really smoothly running department, I had 30-something people working for me. We were running BI for the whole company, and had this real-time financial reporting that we did back then. I decided that was too comfortable and easy, so I left that and moved to the startup world, and that was my first CFO gig after that, and spent about 15 years at 4 or 5 different companies as a CFO in the startup world. I said I was going to do the Cliff Notes versions, and then I rambled. I think we're now out of time for the whole podcast now.
Appreciate your time.
Yeah.
No, that's a great background. And, one thing, this is, I don't know, maybe my 10th or so episode, but, there's no such thing as a conventional path to becoming a CFO anymore. I had what was a conventional path for people who started their careers in the 80s, which was, big 8 accounting firm, accounting manager, controller, CFO. And, there's a million of us well, probably not a million, but there's a lot of us like that. But, these days, to become a CFO, there's just a lot of different ways you can get there because the job itself is so diverse. It's not all about finance and accounting. Obviously, the F is for financial, but, it'll always have that sort of element to it, but it's strategic. It's about mastering technology. It's about communications and whatnot. So it's great that you had a different story than a lot of other people. So the obvious question is, so you've had a great career as a CFO, 5 jobs in 15 years, which is fairly typical for CFOs these days. Usually, depending on whom you believe, about the average CFO tenure is 3 or 4 years. And but now, as they say, what's a nice finance guy like you writing code to create bots? How'd that evolution come up? It wasn't the most obvious thing to me. So
yeah, I always say necessity is the mother of invention. And here's how it started for me. When I was in telecom, surrounded by tech geeks. I mean, there were like everyone would brag about how great they were at Excel, and just try to come up with new Visual Basic or macros or whatever we were doing back then. This is a million years ago, but it was everyone was very technically minded, and I worked with a lot of engineers, and I was tracking metrics for engineers, and I got to the point and we had such a big team that we were reporting, we were trying our best to do predictive analytics back then. Churn in telecom is a big thing, and we were focused on that and all these metrics we were tracking. And then when I left this big team to go to a startup and trying to raise money, I realized for an early stage startup that the way that you could communicate with whether it was equity or debt or whatever financing you were raising, you had to be able to speak the language of either the private equity group or the banker or a combination of both. And to get their attention, you had to present like a bigger company. And in order to do that, you needed more data. And it was my first CFO gig. It was me and we called her a controller, but she was, a senior accountant. And then we had, people doing maybe a part-time person doing kind of AP and AR, just bookkeeping type stuff. And I knew the level of reports that I wanted to get. And I knew there were only so many hours in the day. And of course, a CFO in a startup, you're doing other things beyond. I was managing IT. I was, running HR, and we didn't have people over those. So it was a big.
Oh yeah, facilities. It's people underestimate how hard it is to be a startup CFO, I think. So just because it's so much stuff you have to do. I mean, it's wonderful, but it's just more challenging than people realize. So
yeah. So I guess, I mean, it was kind of like in the early days with websites when I was a journalist. I knew what I needed. I knew I didn't have time to gather all this data. So I started trying to figure out technical ways to get information out of our point of sale systems and out of our project management systems and everything, and trying to aggregate that. And so I kind of got into database stuff. And anyway, just got way down the rabbit hole. But when we went to present, we were a very small, I mean, I think at that time we were probably doing, I don't know, 5 or 6 million in revenue, but we were able to present like a much bigger company, and PE people loved that. And so I was rewarded for doing that. And I realized how much more efficient we could get. And we even got into doing real-time reporting. We had a dashboard back then. And I always, from the beginning of my career, I've realized how important it is to be data driven. And the only way you're going to get there is through automation and being, having as close to real-time access to all the data as you can. So it's, to me, the two have been linked. And if I'd had someone else to do the heavy lifting of the engineering and how to get this, I would have loved to have leaned on them, but I haven't had that luxury. So I kind of had to learn and figure this out as I went.
Yeah, interesting. Necessity being the mother of invention and all that. So cool. So anyway, I was a little curious. So you've created several bots. And the first one was Otto the Auditor, and that caught a lot of attention. And, I thought it was interesting because unless I missed something, you've never been an auditor in your career. So tell us a little about Otto and why you started off with audit first, as opposed to, some other things.
So I don't know if this means I'm petty or vindictive or if I was just trying to prove a point. But so as you know, Jack, I've been traveling around the country talking about generative AI and the potential for it. And for some reason, I've had several people in different venues, non-related, where I'm speaking to finance and accounting professionals. For some reason, it's always the auditors who say, "Oh, my job could never be replaced. You couldn't have a software algorithm do audit." And I thought, I fully, and especially as someone who leads companies through audits, I have no ill will against auditors, but I wanted, if you think about what an auditor is doing, and you think about where AI and generative AI, or just the suite of AI in general, is going, I think it's hubris for any of us to say that my job can't be replaced by an auditor. So I work with a bunch of people in audit now, and I ask them, what are sort of some key guiding principles, documents, rules, regulations that you use in audit? And if you have to go look something up, where do you go? And with Otto, the auditor, the idea was, okay, let me fine tune a model on the specific audit regulations that we use, and see how good it is at answering questions. Now, that was a prototype. I didn't develop it out where it didn't have the ability to analyze data and all that. It was really just a chatbot. So you could ask it questions about, SEC, ASC, whatever rules and regulations and audit standards and, Securities and Exchange Commission and all that, and get answers that were based not just on the overall what these giant large language models know, but something that was really fine-tuned. Think of the LLMs as a generalist and an expert to some extent on all of human knowledge. But if you ask that LLM in a non-specific context, what does ASC stand for? There may be 24 things that ASC could stand for, and that's maybe a bad example. But the idea is, with this specific documentation, when you ask something, it can refer first to that and sort of filter all of its knowledge through in this case, the audit standard. So I did all that, and it took me, I'm not the best programmer in the world. It took me 2 or 3 days to write out to build a model that was, first off, I fine-tuned it, and then I used this, it's called retrieval augmented generation, where I uploaded actual audit documents. But the fine-tuning, I just took a bank of CPA and CFA exam questions and answers and fine-tuned it on a couple hundred of those.
Oh, really?
And then,
okay.
And then I pointed, it's just and fine-tuning is interesting because it's almost like prompt engineering. the fine tuning part of that project was to get the model to be in a mind space where it's answering finance and or primarily accounting questions. And then once you have it in that mindset and you pointed out these specific documents, then you have a really a tailored specialty bot.
Okay. Fascinating. And you said LLM. That was an acronym I didn't actually immediately recognize. What was that?
Large language models. So all these ChatGPT or Anthropic's Claude or Google's Bard, these chatbots all start out as a large language model, which we don't want to get too deep into the weeds on what they are. But basically the model itself, just think of it as like the predictive text when you're writing an email or when you're typing on your phone. It's that predictive text. And then you go through some reinforcement learning, human feedback thing where you train the model to be a chatbot and interact rather than just auto completion. So just in easiest way is just ChatGPT is at its base a large language model.
Fair enough. Thanks. And cool. And now there's rumors floating around that you named Otto after the blow up pilot from the airplane movies. Is that true?
I love that reference, but actually I did not remember that. The blow up pilot that I remember is from the movie Airplane that was based on the show first, right? So so trying to think back to that. So Otto, actually, I liked the alliteration. Otto, the auditor, and of course the icon for it is an otter. So Otto, the otter auditor. It's kind of a tongue twister if you try to say it.
Yeah, that's actually pretty odd. It's funny because I was actually thinking like, why did he come up with this name? And I was thinking like Otto Preminger, the director, or Otto von Bismarck, the leader. Although it's like now I'm probably overthinking this. So, but cool. Yeah. But anyway, you led with Otto, but you've created 9 so far.
So actually 12 now. 12, and here's the crazy thing. So this is the second time that this has happened to me. And actually I'm okay with it. But I spent a weekend building Otto the auditor and then rolled it out on maybe a Tuesday. And then on Friday of that week, OpenAI had their dev day where they rolled out basically what had taken me all weekend to make. Anyone could make one of these in literally 5 minutes.
Oh boy.
And so you have to, but you can build these zero code on the ChatGPT website. You can interact with it just like you do, with ChatGPT itself, but you can say, I need to create a specialist that does XYZ. So that when you do that, so if I just said, I need to create a specialist who's a specialist at audit, it could, make basically as an extended prompt that it's really more prompt engineering that just guides, like I was talking about earlier, that just guides the chatbot to answer in an accounting way, or just to be in that mindset. But the next thing you can do is that retrieval augmented generation that I talked about before, where I uploaded the documents. Now you just drag and drop them into this GPT that you've built. So you can fine tune the prompt, which is what I did with my sort of CPA and CFA exam questions. But you do this just by writing out sentences and telling it what it's an expert at, and then you back it up with actual data for whatever you're building. And it's a template. I mean, you could use this for finance and accounting, but you could do the same thing for, I don't know, a customer service or selling real estate or whatever documents that you go to that you refer to, you now have a tool trained to use these. So once I saw how easy it was to do that, I thought, well, let me just build out the full finance and accounting suite. And I'm still refining them, but I'm pretty happy with, and I've run, not scientifically because I have a day job and don't have time, but I've run tests where you use the fine-tuned GPT model versus just the off-the-shelf ChatGPT or Bard or whatever. And I am seeing better results. And I probably shouldn't say that when it's just anecdotal, but I'd love to get more people out there using them and see what experience they have.
Okay, well, we'll make sure people can reach out to you afterwards and get involved with some of these stuff. So, but yeah, so the 3 that I was initially aware of, I didn't know until recently you'd added the 9 others, but it's Rosie, the CFO, Claire, the controller, and Francine, the FP&A bot. So each one sort of has its specific knowledge set, right? It's,
yes.
So I actually ran a little experiment, and it was really good. So I asked Rosie, the CFO, I sort of described an economic scenario, which is fairly current to what's going on right now. And maybe I'm a remedial user compared to what your ambitions are for this. But I said, right now we're in a time with, capital markets are slower than what we're used to. Inflation is rising. Interest rates are higher than they've been in a while. And we need to prepare for supply chain disruptions. Help me optimize my working capital strategy. And boy, did it come out with great stuff. It's like, enhance receivables management. And then it gave some steps for that. Optimize payables, inventory management, review financing options, cost management, supply chain resilience, risk hedging, and then strengthening cash flow forecasting. Each one of them individually may be not rocket science, right? I mean, but it's like, wow, it came up with a very thoughtful strategic plan for a highly specific, and in this case, what I think is an accurate thing, right? So, and to me, that's fascinating that you were able to create something that did that.
Yeah, and again, it was super easy, and they are. I am still refining these, and I think the technology will get better. But my long-term goal, and again, I'm trying to keep from going too dorky in how I talk about this, but there's a concept of agents where you have you give an algorithm a goal, and then the algorithm sets out on its own to answer that goal, and this agent could employ other agents to help with the goal. So I've fine-tuned Rosie with some specific instructions and some specific documents. But my long-term goal with her is that when you're asking, so one of the bots I created is an economist. So what if you had this one agent that was trained like a CFO, and ideally the CFO knows everything, but we can't all be experts at everything. So you give it the tools that you need, but then what if Rosie she could call on her controller for certain questions, and she could call on the economist for other questions, or call on the FP&A person. And then you have these agents working together, whereas instead of the user prompting at every step, hey, tell me this, and then kind of the back and forth there, you could ask that question to Rosie. She could gather her team, take the insights from all of them, and then give you a consolidated report back of what you should do. Our economist says this, the leading indicators, and et cetera, et cetera. It's not there yet, but all these things that I'm doing, I've got a day job that takes plenty of time, but I also feel like people need to see what's coming. And I'm really advocating for this. I'm not saying people should go out and, fire their staff and turn it all over to my bots today, but now's the time for us to familiarize ourselves with this, so that when there are accessible tools where these issues with hallucination and all the problems that people have with generative AI right now, as those are worked out, we need to be in a position where we're ready to use them. So that's really what drives me to do all this stuff. I mean, all the bots I created are free. I'm not, out there trying to sell these or anything, but I do think it's important for finance and accounting people to get out there and try it out and see what's possible. Build your own. If you can build a better CFO than Rosie, and
yeah, no, that's advice I always tell people. It's like you have to stay on the cutting edge in any job, but particularly CFOs and technology, because, guess what? If you're not on the cutting edge, there's a bunch of other people who are going to be on the cutting edge, and, they're eventually going to, take your job if you think that you can't evolve, right? It's evolve or die type of stuff with technology, I think. So, the tools are fascinating, and, a little crazy that the bots are now able to talk to each other. A CFO bot can consult with an economist bot, and, with a controller and whatnot. But so, how does this change day to day, right? You're a CFO, all of a sudden you've got all these amazing tools at your disposal. How does that change what you're doing day to day? I'm guessing it probably leaves you more time for strategic thinking and in leadership, and less time for the traditional finance and accounting skills, right?
That's exactly it. And I think, again, right now, there's not any, unless you were using one of the applications that, over $100,000 a year, which if you're a big company may not be a lot, but for, SMBs, which is the space that I've primarily worked in, it's too expensive. I am telling clients and anyone I talk to about this, look, today's not the day for you to actually upload your company's proprietary information into the Bard or Claude or ChatGPT, just the publicly available tools that are out there. But now is the time. Go ahead and grab public company information, grab sample data, play around with them and understand, because the day that they get here is coming very soon. And here's the way to think about what AI, and now, I mean, it's funny, I keep wanting to laser in on generative AI, but that's really just one slice of the pie, but it's the one everybody's talking about right now. We're at the peak of the hype cycle on generative AI, and it's the most accessible and the ones people understand the most. But outside of that, just AI itself, we've been using for, at scale for almost 15 years now. Think about everything from spam filters in your email to recommendation systems to self-driving cars. I mean, all this is AI, but it's happening in the background and we don't really understand what's going on with it. But the generative AI, we can interact with and see in real time, what's happening. But the suite of tools that will come out of AI are going to, all the repetitive and menial tasks that we've had to do as part of our job, where it's really just information gathering and data entry, that's going to be the first to be eliminated. And I understand that the impact that that'll have on certain entry-level jobs, but in a time when fewer and fewer people are going into the accounting profession, where and we have more and more at the top retiring, there's this gap that we can't fill. And you think about, if I go get a master's in accounting and I sit for my CPA and I get that, do I really want to start out at this low level job where it's a lot of data entry, or do I want to start adding value right away? So it makes it maybe more appealing. It's like, hey, once you get through the education and you get your certification, then instead of reconciling bank accounts and doing depreciation entries, you're actually taking this information that was already done and adding some value to it. So I think what's going to happen is,
Glenn, are you saying that bank reconciliations and depreciation schedules aren't exciting for a person starting their career?
I'll tell you what, as someone who's been in the startup space, it has been surprisingly not very long since I've done depreciation entries or reconciled a bank account. It's one of those things that I thought in my 50s I would be beyond that, but I'm still getting deep into that. And but that's not the best use of my time. Or it's
But anyway, I apologize. I disrupted the greater point that you were trying to make about young people and the future of the profession.
So here's an interesting thing, and maybe I'm meandering too much here, but people who I think we're drawing from the same pool of people who are now being drawn to business analytics or data science, or maybe some people that historically would have gone into accounting or moving more to finance because maybe salaries are a little higher in finance and even higher still in business analytics or data science. So we're drawing from the same pool. And if we're saying, hey, now come into accounting because it's not all journal entries and bank reconciliations. Come into accounting because you're actually going to be able to provide value earlier because you're going to be the recipient of this information. So come up with a treasury plan or a risk assessment or whatever, greater value you can add. So I think that if we can automate that lower level stuff, it makes the profession more appealing, and it makes the human in the loop part more valuable. When, as humans, there's always a chance for an error, for fat fingering, something which the efficiency that's gained by having a computer do it is significant. And then we just need to keep finding, as more and more steps of the finance and accounting process get automated, the challenge on us is to keep learning more so that we can keep adding value on top of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we're at the point now, computers generally can do everything better. Like I know people, they're reluctant to the self-driving cars. And I understand the concern, but, I always ask people, look, there's about 50,000 car fatalities per year in the United States. Rather than being nervous about it, I think we should look at this as an opportunity to get that number down to, maybe eventually very close to zero. I'm not one to think it would ever be zero, but if we can get 50,000 a year to under 500 a year, that's a significant improvement. Plus, I'm one of those people, I'm constantly working. So the fact that if I can get an extra 45 minutes a day to check email and that type of stuff when I'm not driving, that's a good thing. So, but cool. But I want to ask you just a slightly different tack on this, because, CFOs, they're typically not the early adopters and whatnot. And they're also, in my view, most of them are expected to be the ethical leaders of their own companies. So are there any ethical considerations that CFOs need to keep in mind when developing technology? And leave it to the answer, but what I was thinking of is data privacy and security type of issues. So
yeah, so it is a great question, and one that we have to be aware of as we navigate this. Let me address data privacy and data security first. So I think about SOC, SOC 2, SOC 1 audits that you get, where if you're relying on a system you're getting information out that you're providing to auditors or making business decisions on, you have to be able to, it has to be repeatable and explainable, whatever that system is doing. Now, I think everybody's heard the black box term with AI, where, especially in generative AI, you can ask the same question 100 different times, and each response is going to be slightly different. Well, most of those will be very similar, but if the AI goes down a different path, it could start hallucinating, and it's not repeat. So you can, by just asking the same question over and over and then logging the answers you get, you start to see, okay, how can I be sure that my answer is the correct one? So understanding the models, how they work, being able to have guardrails in that control the output. And these are some of the developments that are being made right now by the large language model, by the Googles and OpenAIs of the world now, to make sure that when you enter a question in, that it's putting out the same information every time, and that you understand why it gave that answer. And in doing that, it goes back to what I said earlier on I'm not telling any companies to upload their proprietary information direct into ChatGPT or any of the other tools that are out there. And you can read, kind of what the disclaimer is from the websites that says, warns you about putting in your information. And really, a lot of them now are saying what you put in here isn't being used to train our models, but someone at OpenAI or someone at Google could actually go in and see everything that you uploaded. They could get hacked. So the risk with all these large language models and the training that's going on with them isn't that necessarily that your information is going to be used to train the model. It's just just like you wouldn't put your social security number into a website unless you absolutely had to. There's just, until these systems are able to be enclosed in a enterprise system that has, say, the level of security guarantees that like a AWS or Microsoft or Azure would have, until it has that level of lockdown on it, I'm telling people, don't put in your information. But when it gets to the point where there are tools that are available where the information has SOC compliance and these privacy guarantees, then it's wide open to use it. I mean, but you treat it the same way you would anything else. It's, well, we can either store our internal information on our own internal data center that we manage, or we can trust it to AWS or another hosting company. So that concern will be the same as it is now, whether it's AI or anything else that we're doing data-wise on the cloud. And the other thing I just want to mention really quick on ethics is these models, every AI algorithm has the potential for bias. And when you design the algorithm and when you put the data in, you try to limit for this. But bias could be whatever data set you have. If it's skewed in one way or another, I think I'm mentioning Amazon again, but I think years ago when they tried to build an AI tool that would select employees that were like the current employees that they had at Amazon because they loved the employees they had. They tried to replicate this. So they just loaded all the current employees' information into an algorithm and said, hire people like this. What they didn't count on in that was the model became biased and discriminatory because it was hiring, mostly white men. It so happened at that time. So by not taking that into account, they built a bad model. But that can happen in every model.
Yeah.
So,
I've heard stories like people have said, create an image of like a nurse, and it'll create a female, create an image of a doctor to create a male. And it's not the fault of the model, right? It's sort of, playing the averages, right? But you do need to understand that it's got some biases that aren't necessarily anyone's fault. Doesn't mean that the biases aren't real and that you can ignore them. You just have to be aware they're out there and adjust, I guess, right? So
yeah, and one I always think of is if you don't think about the consequences of what you're training it on and how you're using the data and how you're letting a machine make a decision for you, redlining is a perfect example of bad data that is discriminatory in homing and housing loans because of based on a zip code or whatever. So they can tend to be discriminatory. So you just need to really be aware of, and that's why I preach how we have to understand. We don't have to become engineers or data scientists or developers, but if we're going to use these models, which I think eventually, maybe sooner than later, we're all going to be using them to some extent, you need to understand at a fundamental level the technology that's behind it, because otherwise you just throwing your fate to the wind. You might as well shake up one of those magic 8 balls, ask it your financial question, shake it up, get your answer and rely on that. So
you don't do that?
And there needs, yeah. I use my 20-sided Dungeons and Dragons dice, for the.
You're much more advanced than I am. So. So no, you're absolutely right. Because I always said, like with driving a car, I never felt like I needed to understand how the internal combustion engine worked. It's not relevant, it works, but this is a little different, right? You sort of do need to look a little bit under the hood here, particularly when you're the leader of a company, particularly dealing with the most sensitive of data that any company has is under your auspices. So.
Yeah. And I think, and we're right to be risk averse. I mean, that's kind of in our DNA as finance and accounting people. So I think that's great, but risk averse doesn't mean ignoring, the biggest technological innovation, at least since, I don't know, the World Wide Web, the smartphone, electricity, if I wanted to be so bold. But I mean, it's been, this is going to be significant and we can't ignore it. And it's just, we're not ready to dive in head first, but it is time to start learning about it and playing around with it.
Yeah, see, I'm a little older than you. I was thinking the wheel or fire. So that's just a generational thing, Glenn. So, but yeah, I mean, to me, it does have a World Wide Web feel, because to this point in my career, I think, when, the internet came out, it's like, what, that's crazy. That'll never catch on. What is this? And then, it was the biggest game changer, not only within our careers, but probably just the very way we live our lives even, right? It would be hard to overstate the impact that the internet has had. And this feels like it has that type of potential to change everything, work and life.
Yeah.
So,
and it's still so unknown, but it's, I think if we'd ignored the internet in the early days of the mid 90s when the first web browser came out, we would have done so at our own peril. Also, though, we might have avoided the .com boom and bust if we let it kind of shake out a little bit. So maybe that's a lesson learned about AI. Learn about it. Don't invest your life savings in it at this point, I think.
Yeah, it's the type of thing. Yeah, with the internet, I mean, a lot of people obviously got fabulously wealthy from it. But yeah, there are a lot of businesses that, probably should never have gotten funded that did. And some of them even went public. And you sort of look back, it's like, why was this a savvy business model? Or, but, people are just placing their bets and they figured if I make 10 bets, all I need is 1 or 2 of them to come out and it can certainly pay for the losses on 8. So it was a crazy time to say the least. But so I want to ask you a question on Gen AI and putting on your crystal ball. You're as well qualified as anyone to ask this. What do you see the CFO role being, 10 years from now? Is it just chief data scientist, or it feels like it's going to change everything, but I don't know what that means. So,
yeah, so I think I have a slightly different view on this from a lot of people, and I think maybe it's because I came up through FP&A. But I really, before I heard the term data scientist, I mean, that's what a good financial analyst is doing, is trying, when you're building your models, you're trying to go, what correlated data, internal or external, can I use to make my model better? How can I get more predictive, and how can I make my forecasts better? And we're going to be held to this. And what can I base it on other than a hunch or just doing a straight linear regression of prior performance? So for me, to be really good at financial analysis, you've had to be kind of a data scientist before, but the expectation that you would be really good at finance, and also, by the way, you could write code and query SQL databases and knew what JSON was and all these other tools to get data. I mean, that's too big of an ask. But now, one of the things that generative AI in particular brings is, so these tools and algorithms are already out there, but if I think back to school and try to remember, now, how did I build an ARIMA model to do forecasting in R, and in taking my time building a model, versus I could do the same thing right now with generative AI. I can say, here's 5 years of data for revenue, COGS, expenses, whatever time series data I want to feed it. I want to say, build me a model that gives me based on ARIMA or whatever, deseasonalize, detrend this data, or do a linear regression, and then run 1,000 Monte Carlo simulations. I can do this all in words, not writing a program. So in my time, and I know CFOs aren't doing this themselves, but my time then gets shifted from either building a report or asking for a certain report and waiting for it, and all this sort of information gathering. Instead, I have all these complex models that I got instantly, and I can shift more to a data-driven decision-making process and bring in more and more data than my team would have been able to, internal, external data. So it's really going to be, I think that executive level jobs will be not just CFO, COO, CRO, whatever you're doing, you'll still lead the way you do, but you'll just have so many more tools to make decisions on. You'll see trends, you'll see correlations, you'll understand the big picture, and it'll be easier to go from, I've been doing this a long time, I have a hunch as to how this will work. Now, because I'll have access to even more data, I can turn that hunch into a hypothesis, run through, test it, and get results. So I think we've got to have our domain experience, but we also need to understand what is possible with data science and analytics and algorithms, so that we know the right questions to ask. So I do see there's still the human need for input, but we just have a lot more information and tools at our disposal. And so we need to understand how to use them.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And, it's fascinating because when, at the start of my career, CFOs were, basically the best accountant would become a CFO. If you were a really good accountant, you had a real good shot at becoming a CFO. And obviously still a useful skill. But now when you think about everything you just said about how it's going to change, probably within 5 to 10 years, that'll be the new reality for chief financial officers. So, but cool. So I'm curious, what do you see as some of the biggest obstacles that prevent, specifically in the world of finance accounting, from adopting these tools? Cultural, business, whatever it might be.
So the biggest one for me is, we're at the end of the day, we have to be right. The numbers we give have to be right. And, whatever decision we make on them, maybe there's, room for error there, but what you present you have to be trusted when they get the numbers from you, whether it's a private company or a public company, although, Sarbanes-Oxley signing off on the financial statements, you have to give the good numbers that are explainable, that you understand. Generative AI right now is not there. So that's why I'm not telling anyone. So all the bots that I built they're proof of concept. I'm not saying fire your team and go use these things, but see what is potential there. That said, I wouldn't trust. I'm not even, and I'm the biggest advocate out there, but I'm not even like trust but verify. I'm going to start with don't trust, then go verify, and then say, okay, you got it right this time. I mean, that's where we are with the technology now, and I think so. But I do think it'll be solved for. I mean, there was this for any geek. If any geeks are really following, there's this program called Q Star that is no relation to QAnon or, but at OpenAI that was this program called Q Star that actually is doing some basic rudimentary math. That once they sort of expand that and the technology gets better, when you get to where 99, whatever your 5 nines, whatever your measurement is, but when you get to what the machines are doing is as you can trust it as much as you would your controller or whoever else on your team giving you information, then it's time to start looking at, okay, let's then we're at trust but verify. So I'm not telling anyone to rush in and use it right now, but I think once that's overcome, there's a fear factor to it of, okay, well, if I give this over to our new robot overlords, what am I going to do with my time? So, but I think trust is the biggest, and then sort of cultural change. And I think just understanding what it means to, I mean, are you going to turn, and I know there's automated close now, but it's still very human involved, but are you going to turn your entire month-end close process over to automation? Where are the checks going to be? And it's a lot. I mean, now at this point, we type into a calculator and get our answer and we don't question it at all. I mean, I think with the pace of this technology, 5 or 10 years from now, we'll definitely be at that, if not 5 or 10 months from now, honestly. I mean, with just the pace it moves.
Oh, yeah, it's crazy. I know a person he's trying to write. In fact, I think you know him too, but he's trying to write a book on generative AI specific to finance people. And he can't because every time it gets through the editing process, it's changed too much. It's like it's going to be out of date the day I publish it. So it's like, how do you do that, right? It's exciting, but it's going to be frustrating too that everything you think is going to be wrong 90 days from now. So it's crazy. So one thing, that it's obvious to me, we live, and rightly so, a situation where regulations and business standards are always evolving. And I think there are some people that would like to say, Gen AI should be exempt from that. I'm not one of those people, but how do we keep Gen AI updated and relevant in a complex regulatory environment that's always growing, right? Are there things we should be thinking about?
So I think about it from the regulators' side, and I think actually, if you look at the regulators, and I keep going back to SOC 2 and SOC 1, because I think they've done a good job of understanding technology before now, and it'll be interesting to see how they evolve for rules around AI. But on the sort of publicly elected, on the congressional lawmaker side, I don't know if there's anyone in government who understands the technology enough to regulate it at this point. And I think that the danger is making rules against something that you don't understand. We don't want to stifle innovation, but we do want to be careful. I mean, I think this is the whole dust up at OpenAI recently is this technology has the potential to make big societal change. So how are we going to prepare for it? And are we just going to open the floodgates and just let it run amok? Or are we going to cautiously and carefully move forward? Certainly, I think 99% of the population says cautiously and carefully move forward. But again, we don't understand as lay people, because we're not machine learning and AI engineers. We don't really understand everything that's going on there. So how do we regulate this? So there's got to be some sort of one base level of education that everybody needs to understand. Everybody who's going to be using it or making regulations about it needs to fundamentally understand what's happening. So there needs to be this partnership between the companies and the engineers who are building, and then the governing bodies to figure out, how to set these guardrails in place. And it's not just about accounting standards. It's also about laws and military applications and terrorist app. I mean, there's a lot that could go sideways with this, and we need to figure it out. And I think I'm talking in circles to say I don't have the answer, but somebody smarter than me needs to be working on, how we come up with this.
Well, Glenn, that's only like 5 or 6 people who are smarter than you. You're really windowing that down, right? So, no,
5 or 6 people in this room where I'm by myself. I don't know.
There you go. Hey, Glenn, we'll cut this part out now, but I've been closing these things with 2 questions, and I don't think I prepared you for them. I did it on the LinkedIn Live, though, that we did a couple of years back. But one of them is, do you have a go-to joke or a hidden talent? Or, is there a fun fact about you that we could ask? I can ask you that question, or given that I believe I forgot to tell you about it, we can just skip it all together. And the final one is some advice for the next generation of financial leaders.
Okay. I think let's go with fun fact. And I'll mention that I have a 200,000 word space opera that I've not finished. That's been sitting on my hard drive for several years now. And we'll talk about I'll throw that out as a complete off the wall thing, and then and then I can do advice. Yep.
So we'll have cut out the last 90 seconds or so. But well, Glenn, this has been fascinating, and I know I learned so much, and I know our listeners will too. But I always like to close on a little bit of a more personal note, and so I'm wondering, old school finance guy, and actually not an old school finance guy, but a finance guy. Do you have a fun fact or something about you that people would find surprising?
My default on this is usually I once shot a man in Reno just to watch him die, but that's not actually true. That's
no time in life books or something from our childhood. So.
I'll give you one. I have a 200,000 word 99%. I've used 99% multiple times in the podcast now. I'm stuck on that, but 99% complete space opera, a 200,000 word space opera that has been sitting on my hard drive since COVID. And I haven't done anything with it because I've been so focused on all this AI stuff. But I hope to get back to that. And I don't know, one day you may see, it may end up having to be self-published because it might be absolute garbage, but I have a 200,000 word novel called The Borrelian Problem. And it might be a little bit about AI as well. So.
How about that? A 200,000 word space opera. So space as in Star Wars, the Jetsons, that type of thing? Okay.
Yes. And opera as in, Star Wars would be a space opera. So it's really just a drama set in the future.
My goodness! So you jokingly said that you shot him in Reno just to watch him die, and then with the space opera, I'm not sure which of those two is actually more believable. I mean, I've known you a while. You're not a violent guy, so I'm siding towards the space opera. But that's crazy. What inspired you to write a space opera?
The same thing that led me into journalism initially. I've always wanted to be a writer, and I guess that's how I ended up writing the finance book as well. I don't know. I actually 15 or so years ago, I wrote and produced a movie as well. So I don't know. I think I have a hard time sleeping, and I have some weird hobbies that have so far they've just been hobbies and haven't netted me a nickel. But it's a fun kind of a right brain, left brain switch from the daily work to a creative outlet.
That's good. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed writing, both of the books that I wrote, and they're not great books, and I certainly, didn't make very much money off of them, but it's such a different process from what we do in our day-to-day thing. I encourage anybody that has that creative juice, just go ahead and write it. My second book, I don't even know if 500 people have read it. So, but you know what? I enjoyed writing it, and maybe the 500 who did learn something from it. So,
and I got to say, I'm going to give a plug for your book now. The second book, I didn't know what to think when I got it. I thought it might be a tongue-in-cheek, sort of corporate overview, but it actually, I was very surprised, pleasantly surprised at how great it was and how astute it was, and it made me think things. Looking back at my own career at CEOs I've worked with, and I just so highly recommend. The Psychopathic CEO is the name of it, right? Yeah.
What's funny on Goodreads, I can read the reviews of it. Sometimes they, I torture myself. doing it, but you can not only see on Goodreads who reviewed it, but other books that they've reviewed. And there are people, they're just classic. They're basing it on the cover or the title, and they think that they're buying a work of fiction. You could, because they're buying all these mysteries and murder stories and true crime and stuff like that. And then my business book with a catchy title. And it's like, gee, no wonder you don't like it. You didn't even read the description of the book before you bought it. But it does have a pretty intriguing title, but cool. But anyway, closing note, I'd love to get your thoughts, Glenn, on just some advice you can give the next generation of financial leaders. What are things they need to be thinking of, whether it's technology or other areas?
Yeah, I do think, to just continue beating this same drum, I think the best thing that, if you're starting out in your career right now, and maybe it's already part and parcel with the position, but if it's not, I think that whether you're on the FP&A finance track or you're on the accounting and audit track, an understanding and interest in the technology that you're using today and where technology is going. And so not that you have to become the technologist yourself, but understanding what that technology brings. So the one that I go to immediately is always data science. And it is, if I have all this data and I can easily get reports on it, how do I know the questions that I need to ask so that I can add value to the data? And the way you're going to get that is having an understanding of business analytics and of data science in general, just so that you can say, hey, I'm looking for a leading indicator and I need to find this correlation. And then when you see a correlation matrix, you understand what it means and you know how to weight and build a model so you can think of the features to put in your model, or you can, just ways to access this technology are going to be very important. Not ways to access it, ways to use it rather, to make your job better. So I think that understanding that analytics and working with large data and small data sets to create more value is going to be a really important focus. So I see a lot of finance or MBAs that are paired with analytics, or finance and accounting people also taking computer science and analytics courses. And I think that's going to be, that's going to be table stakes going forward.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. So Glenn, how can people follow you online?
LinkedIn is probably the best place. I've got a Twitter account, but I don't understand Twitter that much.
Yeah. X, they call it.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm one of I still call the baseball team the Brooklyn Dodgers, for God's sake. So I'm never going to be calling Twitter X. So if you want to follow Glenn online on LinkedIn, just fascinating stuff. It's technical, but it's done because he is a CFO. It is done at the level that a CFO needs to digest it. So he's definitely a must follow, in my humble opinion. Glenn, thanks again for your time, and appreciate it. I know how many things you've got going on these days.
Thank you, Jack. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode. To continue your exploration of this role that focuses on strategy, leadership, finance, and technology, listen to more episodes of the show at rockstarcfos.com. Join this revolution, episode by episode. Push yourself to achieve great things and unlock the best opportunities available to you. CFOs are creating a legacy, and it's time for you to leave your own unique imprint on the world today. That's all for now. See you on the next one.